Marriage is a great institution. Marriage is historically between a man and a woman. You have to have opposites. So you see in just 20 short years, not even 20 years, you go from passing Defense of Marriage Act to then having same-sex marriage recognized throughout the land.
This struggle of a declining empire and a failing society is nothing new.
Right, it's just how things
It's
work.
how things go. It's the natural order of things.
Hey, I want to welcome you to our podcast, Uncensored Pilgrims. I'm Marty McLain.
And I'm Paul Price.
And we are delighted to be with you again. We're going to talk about a subject that used not to be that controversial, but now it is extremely controversial. And as a matter of fact, it can get you blackballed. It can unleash a torrent of hate against you on social media. And the subject is traditional marriage. Marriage being between a man and a woman. That's fascinating, isn't it, Paul?
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing that we have come as far as we have in our society with something as simple as marriage being between one man and one woman. Now, you don't get to where we are overnight. And if you've been keeping up with the news, you know that the Senate recently passed enough votes, had enough votes to get past any filibuster or anything like that for the what they call Respect for Marriage Act. And the Respect for Marriage Act, I think we can agree that it is pretty well misnamed because I think it makes a mockery of marriage in and of itself. But the legislation known as the Respect for Marriage Act would basically codify same-sex marriage in federal law. Now, right now, what we have is an overturning of aspects of what they call the Defense of Marriage Act, which was passed in 1996 under Bill Clinton. He actually signed it into law. But what the Respect for Marriage Act would do is now it would put it into law, not just the overturning of another law. This would actually make it the law, the federal law, that two people who enter into a marriage, be same-sex or opposite sex, that they must be recognized in every state by edict of the federal government. So that is where we are, and we have this coming down the pike. It hasn't been passed yet at the time of this podcast, but it has cleared the necessary hurdles in order for it to become law. And we want to talk a little bit about marriage. First of all, I've been married for 32 years. How long have you been married, Paul?
10 years.
10 years. So, I mean, you got me, an old veteran. Paul is kind of young in the, 10 years. That's a long time to be married, though. I mean, congratulations. 10 years.
Thank you very
I think
much.
You get a badge.
You as well. 10-year badge.
10-year badge. And marriage is a great institution. Marriage is historically between a man and a woman. You have to have opposites. Some people say, well, homosexuality is genetic, and they go that direction. And I always think, just with a simple mind, if it's genetic, shouldn't it be a one-generation behavior? Because it can't reproduce, right?
Well, yeah, I think what they would say, what they're trying to claim is that there would be some kind of gene for homosexuality or something, which I don't really accept that idea.
Right. The gay gene is what they would call it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anything remotely approaching that has ever been discovered scientifically.
Right.
But what they would try to claim is that we don't have any choice in the matter as to whether we're born gay or not.
Yeah, they would go more with nature than nurture.
But I honestly think they're going to go back on that because that's too limiting.
Okay.
If you're born that way, well, how many people could possibly be born that way?
Right. It kind of limits them.
That limits them, doesn't it?
Yeah. You can't. Well, they do recruit because it just is.
I mean, if it's a healthy lifestyle, then why can't it be a lifestyle choice, which is what Christians have been saying it is?
Yes.
But if they're arguing it's a healthy lifestyle, then why would they want to limit themselves to saying, well, it's just a genetic identity that people are born. I don't even think that's really the way they're going with it now. I think they're saying it's an identity that you choose for yourself.
Right, and you can
it's
choose
a healthy
that.
one.
And you can go. Well, I think I heard today. I think that they say out in San Francisco and on some forum they have 97 genders listed.
Well, I can't even keep up with the number.
And the names that they have for them are incredible. I mean, you just think, man, how do people sit around and think of this?
Yeah.
But I'd like to give some of the historical aspects of how we got to where we are. You know, starting in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a move to legalize same-sex marriage. And of all places, it started in Hawaii. In 1993, the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that the state's ban on same-sex marriage was a violation of the state's constitution. Now, this led to 1996 to the passage of the Defense of Marriage Act. It had huge bipartisan support, Democrats, Republicans. Bill Clinton signed it into law, and the law basically defines marriage for federal purposes as being between one man and one woman. And it also allows states not to recognize same-sex marriages that were performed in other states. So, you know, it was a bipartisan agreement that marriage is between a man and a woman. That's kind of back then it was a no-brainer. In 2003, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled in favor of allowing same-sex marriages in the state. So consequently, the next year, same-sex couples began to be legally married in Massachusetts. And in response to the change in Massachusetts state law, many states began to pass laws pertaining to marriage and defining marriages between a man and a woman. Also in 2004, then President George W. Bush called for a federal constitutional amendment in order to defend traditional marriage. And in the ensuing years, there were activist courts in New Jersey and Connecticut legalizing gay marriage in their jurisdictions. But at this time, there still was not enough momentum for a national political leader to support gay marriage. And the lack of public support was made evident by the fact that both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama opposed gay marriage when they ran for the Democratic nomination in 2008. Now, speaking of 2008, that's when the state Supreme Court in California ruled in favor of gay marriage. In response to the activist court, the majority of California voters, 52%, passed what was known as Proposition 8. It was a public ballot initiative which defined marriage as being between one man and one woman. Now, everybody's excited about that. You know, it's kind of surprising that of all places, California majority voted to define marriages between a man and a woman. But in 2010, a federal judge ruled that the Prop 8 was unconstitutional, thus setting the stage for the United States Supreme Court to take up the matter, which they did in 2012. So support grew for same-sex marriage during these years. And on May 9th, 2012, during the height of the race for his second term in office, Barack Obama became the first president to publicly support same-sex marriage. Now, go a year later, June 26, 2013, the Supreme Court rendered in a 5-4 ruling. They said that the federal government must recognize same-sex couples that have been legally married in states. That was followed by the infamous June 26, 2015 ruling known as the Obergefell decision, which made same-sex marriage the law of the land. It overturned certain aspects of the Defense of Marriage Act. So you see, in just 20 short years, not even 20 years, you go from passing Defense of Marriage Act to then having same-sex marriage recognized throughout the land. The speed at which acceptance of same-sex marriage has taken root in our nation with the people, with the politicians, is nothing short of astounding.
Well, and I think we need to ask the question, even in the late 90s, why was marriage something that needed to be defended at all? Why was marriage on the defense in the late 90s to where somebody needed to come up with something called the Defense of Marriage Act? And I think you remember that last week we talked about creation.
Right.
And you can't help but see the connection here. The society and the culture at large have long since abandoned the belief in God as the creator.
Right.
And really, that's where the institution of marriage came from, is God.
So if it doesn't come from God, it's a social construct?
If it doesn't come from God, which the people now don't believe it does,
right.
So where could it possibly come from if not just made up by people?
Right.
And if it's made up by people, then it can be changed.
That's right.
If it's made up by people, then people can change their mind. People's sensibilities can change, and therefore the definition of marriage can be changed. Because if it doesn't come from a higher authority, then we are the authorities.
Right.
And then that means we can change it however we see fit, right? There's
right.
no limit to it.
Yeah, here's the thing I've heard batted around a lot of times about marriage being a social construct. One of the definitions of a social construct is a concept that exists not in objective reality, but as a result of human interaction. It exists because humans agree that it exists. Some examples, anyway. So
money is a
right.
great example of that.
Right. So, it's very unfortunate about what has happened with marriage. Marriage is the building block of society.
Yeah.
If you have strong marriages, then you're going to have a strong country, a strong nation. But if you have weak marriages, probably you're going to have a weak nation, but you might have a more authoritarian government.
Yeah.
Because if families are weak, then it's like in this last election. Did you see who the number one demographic constituent base of the Democratic Party was?
No, who was it?
Single women.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Single women. And I believe there's a correlation. Democrats, therefore big government, social programs, therefore abortion, therefore same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
And so you see a dissolution of the family, and when you have a dissolution of the family, you have a greater role for government to come in and fill the place.
And look into the history of big government, which the best place to look for that is the 20th century, where
right.
the government, we saw the examples of totalitarian government in Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union. And both of those countries had it in common that they dissolved the traditional nuclear family in one way or another. The Nazi government had breeding farms.
Oh, goodness.
Where they would just have basically mass orgies to produce as many children as possible for the purpose of propagating the Aryan race and for producing soldiers, which would then eventually be used to further their empire.
Yeah.
So they had breeding programs.
Good gracious.
And for the essentially the same thing was true of Stalinist Soviet Union as well. They took it a step further, and the Communist Party actually assigned people their wives. Mm-hmm. It wasn't something that they got to choose. Mm-hmm. It was given to them. It was, wow. And like anything in the communist world, I'm sure that, how much influence and money you had would affect, what opportunities you were given, right? But the point is, major totalitarian governments like to break down the family, and that weakens the people and strengthens the power of the government. And a great fictional story that brings this fact into view. I don't know if you're familiar with The Giver. It's actually used as a children's, not young children, but
yes.
it's like a reading book for I think middle schoolers or high schoolers. But it's also a really good movie if you haven't seen the movie The Giver. But it's kind of about a totalitarian society, and And in that society, the government would, have these breeding programs, and children would be assigned to parents that weren't their biological parents.
Wow.
And they're not even allowed to know who their biological parents are.
Wow.
So that and this type of thinking goes way back. Goes way back, I believe, to Plato.
Huh.
Plato was probably one of the earliest totalitarians we have a record of. He had a vision of a totalitarian utopia that called the Plato's Republic.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of modern day totalitarians probably have a history that goes back to taking inspiration from Plato, of all people.
Huh.
So breaking down the nuclear family, I believe it is a satanic ideal.
Right.
If you want to take it to the spiritual realm.
Right.
Satan wants to break down everything that God has made and remake it in his own image. And that includes tearing down the family and tearing down biological barriers that God created. God created biological differences that correspond to his will for marriage. And so...
Well, if you also, with the whole marriage thing, if you're concerned about overpopulation,
yeah,
I do believe that's one of the strategies. You get more and more people involved in same-sex relationships.
Yeah, well, it's definitely true that the prevailing view of the elites in our world today is very much that we have to deal with overpopulation.
Right.
Because again, they don't have a worldview that includes the concept of a benevolent creator God.
Right.
For them, we're on our own, and we've got to figure out how to make it on our own.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the long term, over the future, in thousands and thousands of years, ultimately, life on this planet will not be sustainable with our current industrial lifestyle. We will use up all the resources. We will eventually, I don't believe we're anywhere near this.
No, we got a ways to go.
But eventually we would run out of space if we just kept multiplying exponentially.
Right.
I think they make too much of that for the purpose of gaining power.
Right.
But it is true. If you don't look at it from a biblical perspective, right, the ultimate future of the earth would require us to do something to stop.
You got to get rid of some people. You got to get rid of some industrialization. Therefore, the Green New Deal.
Yeah, you got to stop. You got to stop population growth.
Incredible way to go, and if you want to reduce the use of the world's resources, that's why the whole thing I couldn't understand before about why do they want us to quit eating meat? Why are they against cows? Why are they talking about cow flatulence?
Yeah.
It's like, man, okay, cows have gas. I understand that. And they want to make the big deal about the methane and then the resources that it takes to raise livestock. And now it just came out this week that they were promoting some type of meat that they have created in a laboratory that people can eat. I don't want to eat your laboratory created meat. I just don't have any desire for that. I don't want to put it on my grill. I don't want to fry it in a pan. I don't want anything to do with it. But here's something interesting with government, big government, and the breakdown of the family. When I went over to the Nordic nations, and they have what they call the third way, combination of socialism, capitalism. If I'm not mistaken, they have lower corporate tax rates, but everybody individually is taxed at a high rate. I think overall you're going to pay over 50% in taxes, maybe. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure it's somewhere like that. You don't file jointly. It doesn't matter if you're married or single. Everybody's going to pay, a good chunk of your income is going to be in personal tax. And what happens is that you are beholden to the government, not necessarily united to your family. And I had some conversations with some people over there when I was over in some of those nations. And, they would say that, I was told that the first person to visit your house after you have a baby is a government worker to make sure you can take care of that child. You almost have to have their sanction.
Yeah.
When your parents get to a certain age, I had one person tell me that people couldn't understand why she was taking care of her parents in their old age because just let the government do it. But she felt a responsibility to take care of of
Yeah.
her parents. And over there, at a certain age, you can just let your parents be part of the government system, and that's a
Or to use the giver language, released to elsewhere.
yeah. And Bill Gates even came out in the last couple of days talking about how they're. If I read right, if this was not some like clickbait or something, the possibility of having some death panels or something to
Yeah, well, it's interesting you bring that up.
Useless eaters,
Yeah.
right?
Well, in The Giver, I brought up The Giver. In that story, what the totalitarian government would do is after you reach a certain age, they released you to elsewhere, and the population was kept ignorant as to where elsewhere was, but the reality is that they were all just being killed.
Right.
So they just terminated your life after you got too old. You became a useless eater.
Right.
And so that is where we're headed in a totalitarian world. Why would the government want to hold on to useless eaters, right? So
yeah, I mean, you're just consuming resources, and
it's actually also interesting that you brought up the topic of eating meat, because if you go to 1 Timothy 4, there's an interesting prophecy given there by Paul.
okay,
And he said, the Spirit expressly says that in latter times, and I think that's today,
right,
some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teaching of demons, through the insincerity of liars whose consciences are seared, who forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth.
wow,
And now that's an interesting point, isn't it?
yeah,
That somehow prophetically we're connecting forbidding marriage.
yeah.
Now at the present time, marriage is not yet being forbidden, unless you count the Catholic Church, of course,
Okay,
for priests, right?
yes,
But we are kind of headed in a direction where we could see a full fulfillment of this, forbidding marriage, because eventually I don't see how they couldn't essentially criminalize reproduction the same way that communist China did.
yeah.
So, that's got to be their ultimate goal, is to stop
China did
reproduction.
criminalize reproduction.
They did it.
That's a great way to put it.
In the way of they had that one child policy. I think they've had to repeal it because it was being devastating to their nation.
And wanting everybody aborting their little girls and keeping their boys.
That's right. Yeah.
That makes for a disparity when you get marriage age.
Yeah. Yeah. And then requiring abstinence from foods that God created to be enjoyed. Well, that's where we're headed. So
he wants us to eat bugs.
yeah.
They are literally pushing bugs.
Well, it was good enough for John the Baptist, right?
Well, he did eat some bugs. Because one time, I remember when I was working at Piggly Wiggly down in Vidalia, I went back to the stock area and opened the doors. All these workers were there. Even one of the assistant managers was back there. They said, all right, Marty, put down $1. And everybody's putting down $1. I was like, what's going on? So I put $1 down, and this guy named Nicky picked up a big cockroach and he ate it. And everybody's paying $1 to watch Nicky eat a cockroach. That's South Georgia stuff.
Huh.
And I remember he ate it, and he ate the thing out of its shell and showed us, with his teeth. I mean, and he was just ahead of his time.
Yeah, ahead of his time.
I mean,
exactly.
he was showing us
Because
the future.
that's the buzzword is sustainability.
Yeah.
And if you think about, if you look at it from the atheistic perspective that these leaders have, yeah, I mean, ultimately in the long run, with enough population growth, it will not be sustainable to have more and more farms, more and more cattle, more and more everything. Eventually, yeah, from that naturalistic viewpoint in the long run, because they don't believe that Christ is coming back, right? So they don't believe there's going to be any end to history other than, just the eventual extinction. So they're trying to plan in the long term because they don't believe in a savior.
Right, and you make naturalistic choices.
Yeah,
when you don't have a concept of God, and you don't have a concept of God being the creator of the heavens and earth, and you don't have the concept of God creating the institution of marriage. Therefore, marriage is subject to change. And why don't we manipulate the whole concept of marriage so that we can have people having less children.
Well, here's something that a lot of Christians maybe don't realize, and maybe what I'm about to say will be controversial for some.
Okay.
But if I didn't believe in God,
Right.
if I shared the worldview that these people have, this naturalistic worldview,
Right.
then I would agree with every single thing that they're doing. Because it is logical.
It's logical, yeah,
It's,
you're right.
it's not insane. It's logical from that point of view, which rejects God.
And that's a devilish.
I would
that's
be
a devilish point of view.
if I didn't believe in God, I would be a totalitarian just like the rest of them, and I would want to be on the top of it.
Yeah, I mean, hey, why not be on top? Why not be the
I'd want to
tyrant
be
instead of
I'd want to be the one controlling it.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Survival of the fittest, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd want to be the fittest.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I can completely understand that. But let me just say this: just marriage is between a man and a woman. God set it forth at Garden of Eden. We believe in creation. Therefore, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. There's a procreative aspect.
yeah,
Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. So you have what they would call the creation mandate.
yeah,
We are to acquire knowledge, turn knowledge into technology to improve life. We have the creative aspect, having been created in the image of God.
yes,
There's stuff that you don't have to. You don't have to have a relationship with God to be created in the image of God. You're created in the image of God whether or not you believe in God or not. And there's certain aspects in society that people enjoy having been created in the image of God, whether they acknowledge God or not. We have the creative aspect. We have the rational thoughts. God gives us, His common grace, as some would say, to make for a functioning in society. That's why in Romans chapter 1, when he starts taking that stuff off, when the conscience of man becomes removed, that's when you get an unraveling of a civilization. That's when you get all kinds of horrible behaviors that will define a culture and eventually destroy a culture from the inside out.
Exactly.
And you don't want to go there. And part of that, if you read Romans 1, is the acceptance of homosexuality. It's something that people are given over to. It is said to be unnatural. Now, let me just say, in our culture today, let me just give you a few little rundown of examples. Are you familiar with Candace Cameron?
a little bit, not strongly familiar, but
Everybody watched
name.
her on Full House when she was a child. She's grown up. She's, I think, maybe in her mid to late 40s now. She's been on Hallmark TV all these years. I think some people call her the Queen of Christmas because she makes all the Christmas movies. And
the Hallmark Christmas movies.
Yeah, the feel good, you know what's going to happen. They don't like each other at first.
Yeah.
Then they like each other, and then something happens toward the end where they almost don't get together, but then they get together and they kiss and it's over. Well, that's kind of every movie on there. But anyway, Hallmark has gone in a...
I can't bring myself to watch Hallmark Channel, I have to be honest.
Okay. I have to admit, I watch them, I don't,
Yeah.
Me and my wife will watch them, and she'll go to sleep, and I'll watch it, and then she'll say, "Oh, what happened?" I say, "Well, he likes her, she likes it." I feel so ashamed that I know all these plots. And anyway, so Hallmark's gone in the LGBTQ direction.
Yeah.
They've suddenly brought in these characters, and they even have some of the Christmas movies now are gay themed, and so she left that network, and I think the guy who used to run Hallmark left, and they started Great American Family TV. And in her interviews about the Great American Family TV, she said that said, quote, that they will keep traditional marriage at the core of the program. That was it. Oh, you would have thought that she said the most hateful thing.
Yes. I
mean, people have come out against her. One of the people who came out against her that was so disappointing was Holly Robinson Pete. She is the wife of Rodney Pete, who's quarterback USC back there in his college days. He's an NFL quarterback. They're a Christian couple, and I've always liked Rodney Pete. Thought he was a great guy, and they had a reputation as a good Christian couple who were, But anyway, here's what she responded. She responded to what Candace Cameron said. Holly Robinson Pete, she's also on the Hallmark Channel as well. She said, "Y'all, why are people so pressed and stressed about who other people love? Are they hurting you? Ugh, I can't stand a bigoted, judgmental, holier-than-thou person. Mind your business."
Mm-hmm.
Now,
And then
now she's now
hashtag love is love.
hashtag love is love. Now, like I said, Holly and Rodney have had a reputation as a Christian couple, but their daughter came out as gay 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have found that when somebody's child comes out as gay, sometimes if they're not careful, the parents will change what they believe.
Because it's too hard for them to maintain their beliefs. They don't want to lose their relationship with their child, and they're willing to sacrifice their principles in order to maintain that relationship.
Right, and they get confused that now I have 4 kids. They're all grown. I love my kids. I love my kids like life itself.
Yeah,
I'd do anything for my children. Okay, but if they were engaged in a behavior that put them at odds with God, and homosexuality puts you at odds with God, it's a very precarious place to be.
Yeah,
I would not be showing them love if I said, you know what, I'm going to accept you in that behavior, and I'm going to say that behavior is okay because I love you. That would be the worst thing I could do.
yeah,
What I would do is say, look, I love you. I will always love you as my child. I'll always be there to support you, but I cannot support you in this lifestyle. This is a wrong lifestyle choice. Now, there was a congressman, then he became senator, but back when he was a congressman, Rob Portman from Ohio, he was one of the co-sponsors in 1996 of the Defense of Marriage Bill, Defense of Marriage Act. And he was always known as a proponent of family values in Washington. He eventually became a senator from Ohio. And in 2013, he became the first Republican senator to support same-sex marriage. And here's what it says. This is an article from the Cincinnati Enquirer, March 15, 2013. It says, Republican Senator Rob Portman said Thursday that he now supports gay marriage. A surprise turnabout on a hot-button social issue sparked by a deeply personal reflection that began 2 years ago after Portman's son Will told him he was gay. It's a change of heart from the position of a father. That's what Portman said. Okay? He said, quote, I think we should be allowing gay couples the joy and stability of marriage. Continues, I have come to believe that if two people are prepared to make a lifetime commitment to love and care for each other in good times and bad, the government shouldn't deny them the opportunity to get married. He adds, this isn't how I've always felt. So here he is. He says that he changed what he believed about same-sex marriage because his son came out as gay. Okay? Here's what this article says. Portman was among those who, as a member of the House in 1996, voted in favor of the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriages between a man and a woman and bars federal recognition of same-sex marriage. It also says states can't be forced to recognize a same-sex marriage performed in another state. Portman also voted in favor of a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage when he was in the House. Now, when he changed, here's what he said. Quote, the overriding message of love and compassion that I take from the Bible and the fact that I believe we are all created by our Maker, that has all influenced me in terms of my change on the issue. So you know what he did? He brought God in on it. The Bible, being created in the image of God. Now, fast forward, if you will, to today. We're here in 2012. Guess who is...
Well, this isn't 2012.
I'm sorry. We're here in 2022.
Yeah.
Pardon. Here is an article from the Ohio Capitol Journal. It says the United States House passed a bill protecting marriage equality in July. Although it was in the House, Rob Portman, made his stance in support of the bill very clear by co-sponsoring the companion bill in the Senate. Mm-hmm. The Respect for Marriage Act would make sure that every legal marriage would be considered legitimate and would prohibit any state from discriminating against same-sex couples married in other states. So here's what happened. Rob Portman is now an advocate,
Yeah.
a proponent
Yeah.
of making all of us have to accept same-sex marriage because his son came out as homosexual,
Yeah.
and that changed his view. And now Rob Portman is spearheading this Respect for Marriage Act.
Yeah.
Now that, to me, that is such a change, and he admits that it's because of his love for his son. Now his love for his son is now pushing on your children, my grandchildren.
Yeah.
He's pushing same-sex marriage, which we think from reading the Bible is immoral. But now he's pushing that on our families because of the love of a father for a son.
Yeah. Well, and there's a common saying, you can't legislate morality. And there's truth to that in the sense that the government cannot make you want to be a moral person.
Right.
But nonetheless, it is bad that these things are happening because while you cannot legislate morality, you do legislate people's actions
Yes.
for the protection of other people and for the protection of society at large.
Right.
And so that's why certain drugs are illegal, for example, because the government has made a determination that it would do damage to society at large if these drugs were made commonly available.
Right.
And I think the same thing is true with same-sex marriage. It's not going to change people's hearts one way or another if it's legal or illegal. But making it legal is going to make it more commonplace.
Well, making it legal is going to put good people in litigation.
Well, it's going to do that, and it's also going to create the impression that there's nothing wrong with it.
Right.
But you go back to the founding of this country, the founding fathers were presiding over a mostly Christian nation.
Right.
And the statement was made, I forget which individual made it, but the statement was made that the Constitution they were framing was only really sufficient for the government of a moral people.
Yeah.
And I believe that's true, and that's why we have a failing, dissolving society today.
We will. You're right. Our country's made for moral people now. You can't even watch the United States soccer team without being hit in the head with the LGBTQ message. I don't know if you know this, but they have recently changed their crest, their emblem for their team, to a rainbow-themed crest. It says the shield change is a part of the squad's Beat the Change initiative that launched in 2020 on the heels of social unrest. So what they do now, here's what their spokesman says: as a part of our approach for any match or event, we include rainbow branding to support and embrace the LGBTQ community, as well as to promote a spirit of inclusiveness and welcoming to all fans across the globe, except those fans who believe in traditional marriage.
Yes, exactly.
It is not inclusive. Let's face it. It's very exclusive. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at the way some of the people were treated during the course of when they were making same-sex marriage legal, when there was certain events that happened, certain celebrities, certain famous people got into crosshairs, be it Kirk Cameron, Tim Tebow, Dan Cathy, David Tyree, Phil Robertson. I mean, look at what they did to them. They finally, even with Chick-fil-A, with Dan Cathy, they finally got him to the point, it was a Forbes article, I think, where he said, I still believe what I believe, but I'm just going to shut my mouth and sell chicken.
Yeah.
Basically, let's paraphrase. Basically, I hadn't changed what I believe, but I'm just going to sell chicken. Now, you don't hear the CEO of Starbucks, Target, Amazon, any of those people. They did not have to back down on their stance about same-sex marriage. Why? Because they were for same-sex marriage. But you get a CEO, an owner of a corporation like Chick-fil-A, and he says, just an interview that he said, yes, I support traditional marriage. I believe marriage is between a man and a woman. Everything breaks loose against them, and they make it where, okay, you can believe what you want to, but you better be quiet about it.
Yeah, well, and that's look at corporate America today. is, activist corporations being active on social and political issues. That's okay as long as it's liberal.
Right.
If it's conservative, it's not okay. I mean, just look at one of the most flagrant offenders in this area would probably be Ben and Jerry's.
Oh yeah.
You can't walk within 15 feet of a Ben and Jerry's without being slapped with some kind of a liberal political message. And here in the Atlanta area, I actually saw them flying a political banner in the air, "Go vote."
Yeah.
Over Atlanta.
Yeah.
And
but that's supposed to be okay. No supermarket is going to take them off the shelves because they were for it. But had they come out against same-sex marriage, then there would be calls and cries. You'd have people they would cancel them. They'd take them off the shelves.
Well, I don't need Ben and Jerry's to tell me to go vote.
Yeah.
That's none of their business whether I go vote. It's not their job. Corporations getting involved in this stuff is a very bad thing. People need to stop tolerating it, but it's always a double standard.
Well, here's the deal. This is a press release, November 15th, 2022. This is the manufacturer's call for passage of the Respect for Marriage Act. Here it is. Today, the National Association of Manufacturers released the following statement calling for passage of the Respect for Marriage Act. Now, this is the National Association for Manufacturers. I mean, they're getting involved in marriage, okay? It says, quote, manufacturers know that individuals truly thrive in their careers when they can bring their authentic selves to work and feel confident that their families will be safe from discrimination or worse in the place they've chosen to live. The Respect for Marriage Act would ensure that the legal protections around which so many Americans, including manufacturing workers, have ordered their lives will not be suddenly rolled back. Codifying federal protections for interracial marriages and same-gender marriages with appropriate protections for religious liberty will keep all families equal under the law and ensure that manufacturers can continue to hire and retain a diverse and talented workforce.
Yep.
It will deliver families and businesses the certainty they need and deserve. Now, let me tell you something. Why in the world do they feel the need to be involved in this issue? I mean, I read that and I still think, why do they feel the need to be involved? Here's what's so deceptive about what's being done. They include interracial marriage with the same gender marriages. Nobody's got a problem with interracial marriage. And I'll tell you how ridiculous this is. The reason why they came up with the Respect for Marriage Act is because Clarence Thomas, the Supreme Court Justice, after Roe v. Wade was overturned, Clarence Thomas said, perhaps we need to go back and revisit the Obergefell decision.
Yeah.
And so they said, oh no, we're going to have to codify that so that they can't overturn the Obergefell decision. So in their writing up of this, they want to include interracial marriage in order to get more people on board.
Yeah.
Clarence Thomas, who I think personally is the best Supreme Court justice we got.
Yeah.
He's my favorite Supreme Court justice. But Clarence Thomas, he's a black man. He's married to a white woman. Jenny Thomas is white. Clarence Thomas is black. That's interracial marriage. Mitch McConnell, who's the leader of the Republicans in the Senate from Kentucky, senator from Kentucky, he's married, what's her name, Elaine Chao? That's his wife. She's from Chinese descent.
Okay.
That's an interracial marriage.
Yeah.
So you have the Supreme Court justice, the head of the Republicans in the Senate. This is not nobody's coming against interracial marriage. That's not an issue. Nobody has a problem with it. There's nothing wrong with interracial marriage. What's wrong is when a believer marries a non-believer. Now you got a biblical problem with that.
Yeah.
But this
the Bible doesn't teach that it's a sin in any way. Unfortunately, though, there is a history of Christians in the past abusing the Bible.
Exactly.
In the past, it's not really a problem for most people today.
That's long.
Yeah, that's long history.
That's a long time ago. But there's no clamoring about this interracial marriage. I mean,
But they're using it as a bait and switch.
It's a bait and switch. Nobody's talking about interracial marriage. Nobody's got a problem with interracial marriage. I mean, X number of marriages in our culture and society is interracial. That's fine, as long as it's a man and a woman.
Yeah.
The problem arises when it's the same gender. That's where you get to where you are violating Scripture.
And it's not just a violation of Scripture, it's a symptom of an underlying spiritual problem. It's a symptom, the Bible identifies it, Romans 1,
Right.
very clearly, as a symptom of the rejection of God.
It is a symptom of the rejection.
So we don't need
You're
to
right.
think of this as a problem in and of itself. We need to look at it as a symptom of an underlying spiritual sickness in our culture. And this is not, the interesting thing here is that this is nothing actually new. There's a really interesting essay that was written in the late 70s by a former British officer by the name of Sir John Glubb. You can get it online. You can find it as a
Spell
PDF.
his last name.
It's Glubb.
Glubb.
And you can find this this essay easily online as a download. And it was written in the 70s, but it's so prophetic in what we're seeing happen today. And he talks about this kind of cyclical way that empires start out in a certain way, and we don't have time to go through the whole thing that he goes through, but he says that empires have stages of development: early, middle, late.
Right.
And the late stage he identifies is a stage of decadence and decline,
Right.
which ultimately ends with the dissolution of that society.
We're in the middle of decadence and decline, I can tell you that.
And what's interesting is that he identifies things like, for example, he talks about the Arab Caliphate that existed in Iraq in the 900s.
Yeah.
And that was one of the empires that came out of the birth of Islam, because we know that Islam was a militant religion from the start.
What does Islam mean? Submission to Allah?
Submission to Allah is what I've heard.
Yes.
But they would go through and they forcibly attacked neighboring countries and created an empire. Well, even that empire went through this cyclical series of stages. Mm-hmm. And for example, Glubb writes, "The works of the contemporary historians of Baghdad in the early 10th century are still available. They deeply deplored the degeneracy of the times in which they lived, emphasizing particularly the indifference to religion, the increasing materialism, and the laxity of sexual morals." Mm-hmm. This was in the 10th century.
Yeah.
So it's not like this is something that's only happening in our day.
Ain't nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun. The historians commented bitterly on the extraordinary influence acquired by popular singers over young people, resulting in a decline in sexual morality. The pop singers of Baghdad accompanied their erotic songs on the lute, an instrument resembling the modern guitar.
Now, what year was this?
This was in the 900s AD.
So you basically had a Iraqi Elvis or something?
Exactly, yes. In the second half of the 10th century, as a result, much obscene sexual language came increasingly into use, such as would not have been tolerated in an earlier age. Several caliphs issued orders banning pop singers from the capital, but within a few years they always returned.
Wow.
So this struggle of a declining empire and a failing society is nothing new.
Right, it's just how things
It's
go.
how things go. It's the natural order of things.
Which is sad.
And it even applies to non-Christian societies, apparently, because the example I was just talking about, this wasn't a Christian society, it was an Islamic society, which is based on Christianity, but it's a cult. It's a cult of Christianity. Right. So, but this is a natural law. You cannot break the natural law of how things are supposed to be. They're set up by God.
Right.
The unbelievers cannot help but live in God's universe, even if they deny God.
God still has an order, whether or not people are believers or not. Here's the thing I got. Sometimes people say, well, you can't expect non-believers to act like believers. And that's true. I told you, I 100% agree that. But you can still set forth the standard, because even the unbelievers are going to be judged.
Yeah.
There's a standard. And sin is sin. And when people realize, oh no, I've fallen short of that standard, then they look for help.
Well, and
that points them to the gospel that
Yeah.
Jesus died on the cross for your sins, And you can be forgiven. People in homosexuality and lesbianism, you can be forgiven. I mean, there's forgiveness, but you've got to accept what God says.
Well, and the Bible talks about kind of two different types of judgment. There's God's judgment in a spiritual sense, which comes on us from sin, and ultimately the end judgment is salvation or damnation.
Right.
But in a temporal sense, there's also a fleshly judgment that comes from denying God's order.
Right.
And you can look in that in many ways. Like, for example, if you jump off a cliff because you think you can deny God's order of gravity,
right,
the judgment will be that you will be killed, right? Because you just tried, you found that you cannot overcome God's order.
Right.
Gravity still works regardless of whether you believe in it. Mm-hmm. And the same applies to societies and sexual morals. Paul talks in Romans 1. He talks about homosexuality, and then he curiously, he talks about those who engage in it receive the due penalty in their body for their error. Well, what is he talking about there? I think he's talking about sexually transmitted diseases.
Could be.
Because they're rampant in the homosexual lifestyle.
It's not a healthy lifestyle.
It's not healthy, and you're using biology in a way God didn't design it.
It's not designed right like that by God, and people just, when you go against God's order, and we have specific revelation, particular revelation, whatever you want to call it, Scripture,
special revelation.
Yes, and we have that, and we know, this is who Jesus is, what He's done for us, what's the end state of everything's going to be, how it's all going to end up. We know that from Scripture. We've got to, but also there's a general revelation that God has made Himself known in a general way to all people at all times.
Yeah.
And there's a conscience that God has placed within the lives of people, to where there's kind of a hardwired knowing of certain things are right and wrong.
Yeah.
And there's kind of a hardwired way we're supposed to function.
Yeah.
And throughout all these cultures, throughout all these years, people have figured out it's going to take a man and a woman to have a baby.
Yeah.
If we want to continue on, if we want to have enough soldiers one day to take on these other people that are coming against us, we're going to have some babies. The way we're going to have some babies, we're going to have men and women.
Yeah.
There's got to be procreation between the two sexes. And so people, whether or not they believed in God, whether or not they knew Christ, and knew that men and women,
they knew what worked.
Procreate.
They knew
there's a the parts work.
Yeah.
And there's something that happens from the parts working. But now when you start going against what is universally known,
yeah,
I think you enter a different level of rejection of God.
Yeah, and the end of that is ultimately societal collapse.
It is societal collapse. When you get to where we are, you are headed towards societal collapse unless God sends revival among His people and an awakening among the lost.
Yeah. And in the last few minutes we got here, Marty, you mentioned to me something about this new act about the Mormon Church coming out in favor of it, which is interesting.
Here's what the Mormon Church said about it. I'm not a proponent of Mormonism. I believe they're a cult. I go to the history of it. I don't mean that Mormons are not nice people, because most of them are pretty nice. But the
ones that I've known have all been nice.
The doctrine of Mormonism is another gospel. And it says in Galatians, if anyone preaches another gospel, let him be what?
Accursed. And you remember we talked about it, was it last week that we did the Aliens podcast?
2 weeks ago.
Or 2 weeks ago. Yeah, that's right. 2 weeks ago we talked about aliens, and we actually ended up talking about Joseph Smith.
Right.
Because he had one of these experiences that are similar to the alien abduction experiences.
Right, and he went his own way and started his own stuff. But here's what he said. This is a statement from the Mormon Church. 17 million Mormon Church, based in Utah, obviously. Says, quote, "We believe this approach is the way forward as we work together to preserve the principles and practices of religious freedom together with the rights of the LGBTQ individuals. Much can be accomplished to heal relationships and foster greater understanding."
Yeah, and it's interesting. The Mormon Church has traditionally been highly conservative, but I have noticed that in recent years,
there's a drift.
in recent years, the leadership of the Mormon Church has been trying to get more and more acceptance in the mainstream.
Right.
And the only way they can do that is by
compromise.
making statements like this.
Yeah, and of course, Mitt Romney, who formerly governor of Massachusetts, the 2012 Republican nominee for president, kind of abandoned his campaign right before the end of the presidency, the presidential run. I didn't understand that. But anyway, now he's the senator from Utah. He's kind of been all over the place on some of his positions. But as a Mormon and as a senator from Utah, he was one of the 12 Republicans who voted in favor of the Respect for Marriage Act. Yeah. And, of course, he obviously had the backing of the church.
Well, and the Mormon Church, of course, has an interesting history on the whole institution of marriage because going back to the early days of Joseph Smith, he had a problem with the biblical teaching on
one man
marriage,
and one woman.
One man and one woman.
He liked the ladies, didn't he?
He wanted to institute polygamy, the idea that they could have Mormon men can have multiple wives.
Well, Paul, we sure have covered a lot today about marriage. Not all of it's good. Matter of fact, most of it's not good. But we are definitely headed down a road that we do not need to travel, and it does not end well. When you deny God's explicit blueprint for the family, and you call something else respect for marriage, and it is contrary to what is explicitly taught in Scripture and what has been practiced for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years throughout the world, and now all of a sudden you've got a new definition, and that is what you have respect for marriage. So we'll just have to see how this thing plays out, and unless God intervenes, it's not going to be good.
And I think what we need to remind people about Christians, about is that, like we said earlier, this degeneracy in sexual morality is just a symptom of the fact that people have left the Bible as their foundation.
Right.
And the way that you deal with this isn't to become a culture warrior and go out and fight over marriage.
Right.
The solution is to preach the gospel and turn people's hearts back to the truth
They got to be turned
in
back
the
to
Bible.
God. Right.
If you don't do that, you cannot possibly win the so-called culture war.
Right.
We're on a losing trajectory in that culture war.
Yeah, so we got to preach the gospel, and we got to live out what it means to be married.
Yeah.
You got to make the best of your marriage.
Yeah.
So if you're married, make the best marriage you can have. Don't divorce your spouse. Don't cheat on them. Be faithful. Be monogamous. Honor God. Marriage is a picture of Christ and the church. Even the Bible ends with the picture of marriage. The supper of the Lamb.
Yeah.
And so marriage is very important. It's very important. God established in the Garden of Eden, talked about in the last chapters of Revelation. So make the most of marriage you've got. Never apologize for believing that marriage is between a man and a woman. Stay the course. Stand your ground. Do so with the love of God and the power of the Holy Spirit. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. And we need to let you know that the views that we express on this podcast belong to Marty McLain and Paul Price. They are our views. They do not reflect the views of anyone else. And with that said, we hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time on the podcast.